Sir John. You know where I stand on it, but in the course of this interview, I shall be entirely dispassionate, except in this regard. As a keen observer of nationalism's ups and downs, I was active in politics when Winnie Ewing broke through for the first time in the 1960s. This looks like a down period to me, and one in which infighting and stresses and strains inside the nationalist movement looks likely to get more virulent still. How does it look to you?
Well, you're right. There is a degree of dissension within the nationalist movement, but it's one, of course, that's essentially being articulated by Alex Salmond and the Alba Party. But in the end, the Alba Party didn't make any breakthrough last May. They've probably only got about 2 or 3% support. Now, I know they do reflect the views of a section of society in Scotland that is impatient about the fact that Nicola Sturgeon hasn't called the referendum already and feel that they should be pushing the independence button sooner rather than later. I have to say to you that my reading of public opinion in Scotland, here crucially, my reading of those people who would vote yes in an independence referendum, which is roughly half of Scotland, most of whom voted for the SNP or some of them for the Greens on the list vote, is that actually they're inclined to be relatively patient. Virtually all of them want a referendum at some point during the course of the next 5 years. But quite a few of them are saying, well, as long as it's sometime within the next 5 years, that's fine. It doesn't certainly have to be this year, probably doesn't even have to be next year. And I think to that extent, at least, Nicola Sturgeon's probably got quite a lot of leeway. And it's frankly leeway that she needs, because where are the polls at the moment? Probably about 51% for no, 49% for yes. Therefore, going early is not in Nicola Sturgeon's interest, because a referendum would be an enormous gamble. It's also, by the way, not in Boris Johnson's interest, because an early referendum would be an enormous gamble for him, because frankly, we do not know what the outcome of an independence referendum would be if it was held relatively soon. And of course, the truth is that an awful lot has changed since 2014. And both sides, both nationalists and unionists, have an awful lot of homework to do to work out what their arguments are going to be for and against independence in a world that's frankly been changed by Brexit. Brexit has certainly changed the character of support for independence. One of the ironies of the 2014 referendum is that although we spent hours arguing about whether or not an independent Scotland could be a continuing member of the European Union, attitudes towards the EU proved to be utterly unrelated to whether or not people voted for independence. Those days are over. As a consequence of Brexit, supporters of people who want to be inside the European Union, it's now very clearly a majority who want independence, but Leave voters, in contrast, support for independence has fallen away. So that Brexit and independence have now become intertwined, but Brexit has changed the argument. There's going to be an argument about what do you do about the single market border, given that an independent Scotland would want to rejoin the European Union. What do we do about that? But equally, how do unionists argue that it's better for Scotland to be in a relatively small single market, which is the United Kingdom, as opposed to being in a much bigger single market, which is the European Union? So we are now looking at a very different choice that the Scottish voters face. I think it's a major geostrategic choice, but it's one that requires both sides to think through their arguments once more, because the arguments that they used in 2014, for the most part, have been overtaken by events, not least the change in position on oil, though of course the price of oil has gone back up, but nobody wants to use oil anymore, not even the SNP wants to use oil. So we're talking about what do we do in a world that's trying to deal with climate change, and what do we do in a world that's now been changed by Brexit? That requires both sides to rethink their arguments, and we've not really had that argument yet, and therefore we don't really know what voters will make of it.
Now, when you give these numbers, knife-edge numbers, 51, 49, does that exclude don't knows? And if it does...
Sure. That leaves aside the don't knows, but to be honest, there aren't that many don't knows.
No, but it is true, isn't it, Professor, that in 2014, the don't knows broke very heavily for no, for remaining in the United Kingdom. By some factor.
I'm not sure that's true, George. I mean, at the end of the day, the story of the 2014 referendum is that although the Yes side didn't win the referendum, they certainly won the campaign. I mean, probably if the referendum ballot had been held back in October 2013, when the ballot was agreed, it might have been a 2-to-1 vote for staying inside the UK, and in the end, it ended up 55-45. So I'm not sure you're right. And in the end, the truth is that most people, had a pretty clear view. The polls slightly overestimated the vote for yes in the end, but polls were saying about 53-47. We only ever had 1 or 2 polls that ever had yes ahead. It always looked pretty clear that yes, we're going to win, and yes, indeed did. Sorry, that no, we're going to win, and in the end, no, indeed, duly did win.
I don't want to dwell on the 2014 because, as you say, a lot has changed, but it was the biggest turnout there has ever been.
Absolutely.
In a vote in Scotland. It was on the date with the question, with the franchise, picked by the separatist side, and they still lost by 10 clear points. But you really think it's gotten closer? You see, I think it's gotten wider, I think.
And George, it's Brexit what's changed it, all right? Virtually all of the increase in support for independence is accounted for by the fact that there are some people who've switched from yes to no. So there are some people who voted leave, and around 1 in 3 of those people who voted yes in 2014 voted in favour of leaving the European Union. But people who voted no and leave are considerably outnumbered by about 2-to-1 by people who voted no and remain. And some of them have switched to yes. And because they're much more numerous, it was almost inevitable in the long run that the pursuit of Brexit was going to undermine support for the Union. And that is what has happened. Support for, basically, I can account for virtually all the increase in support for independence, which basically transpired in 2019 as we were arguing about whether or not Brexit should be implemented or not. Basically, all of it can be accounted for by the rise in support for independence amongst Remain voters. And I know, George, you're a backer of Brexit, but the truth is, anybody who wishes Scotland to remain inside the Union, who pursued Brexit, simply has to recognise that support for Scotland remaining inside the United Kingdom has been a piece of collateral damage for that cause, which, during the referendum campaign, if it ever happens, is something that the Unionist side will have to try to do its best to repair.
All of this, of course, may be entirely academic because in the course of this Parliament, this Prime Minister is not going to permit another referendum. The prospects of an illegal referendum or persuading the courts to allow a referendum notwithstanding the opposition of the government took a setback, didn't they, this week past, when ultra vires was a phrase suddenly remembered again. The Supreme Court deciding that the Scottish Government was doing things that it had no power to do. Yeah,
you're quite right. There was a Supreme Court case this day that struck down a couple of bills that actually were passed unanimously by the Scottish Parliament, or at least it struck down certain provisions of those bills. In particular, what upset the Supreme Court were some clauses that said that in future acts of Parliament should be interpreted in such a way that were consistent with the legislation that was passed by Holyrood. And perhaps it wasn't a great surprise that the Supreme Court said, no, that definitely breaks the terms of the Scotland Act reserves the right to, the UK Parliament, the right to legislate in devolved matters, and therefore you cannot do this. Now, I think what's also true, if the Scottish Parliament were to attempt to implement a referendum of the kind that was held in 2014, then again, I think almost undoubtedly that would be ruled as ultra vires. But the interesting question is what would happen if the Scottish Parliament come up with something different? And way back in the days of the minority administration of 2007 to 2011, they came up with the idea of asking a referendum which said, do you think that the Scottish government should enter into negotiations with the UK government with a view to Scotland becoming independent? And shall we say, when 2 or 3 public lawyers were gathered together to debate as to whether or not this would be ultra vires, we got 5 or 6 different opinions. And the truth is, we don't know. I think most public lawyers think probably the court would strike it down, but it probably isn't as clear
a clear and obvious error, I think he was about to say. Shall I go to my second question? What did wrong?